was on holiday last week and I was buying a hot chocolate for myself in a cafe, and the woman in front of me went berserk. She started shouting at the staff, saying, "I'm not going to wear a mask. These rules and regulations and laws are ridiculous about COVID-19. It impinges on my freedom. We're all going to die anyway. And I haven't been able to see my mother, who's 97 and in a care home, for 6 months. And I'm unlikely to see her anytime soon. These laws are ridiculous. And can I have a cappuccino and 2 sugars?" I'm sure if you work in retail, you've met customers like that. Some customers obey the law. Some people don't. Some people understand it. Some people don't. I think we're all in a different situations. Some people think the law is too lax and it should be stricter, like it is in other parts of the country and in other countries. Some people think it's too stringent and the rules should be relaxed. It's strange how so many people are getting energised by the law because, of course, it applies to all of us. We have rules and regulations and laws at work and at school and at college and university, but nobody reads them until they apply to them. Nobody says, "Oh, I know what, I'll read the maternity pay policy in this organisation. I'm not going to have a baby, but I just thought I'd read what it says." No, you read the rules and regulations and law when they apply to you. So it may surprise you that some people want to read the law in the Old Testament. Now, it could be they just want to read the first 5 books of the Bible, which are often called the law, or they might want to read the whole of the Bible. And if they do that, one of the ways is to follow a guided reading plan, but another way is to start at the beginning. Now, if they do start at the beginning, people will scoff and say, "I think you've chosen a difficult method." But, you press on, you start to read Genesis, and you think, well, this is quite interesting. It's got the creation, Adam and Eve, Noah, Cain and Abel, Abraham, Joseph and his coat of many colours. Well, that's pretty straightforward. And then you read Exodus, Moses and Aaron, the 10 Commandments, crossing the Red Sea. 50 chapters in Genesis, 40 chapters in Exodus, and you feel as though you're doing well. This reading of the law is straightforward. And then you come to Leviticus. Now, it's tedious to say the least. 5 chapters on the procedures of sacrifices, 3 on the ordination of priests, 3 on the consecration of the tabernacle and dietary laws, then a chapter or so on childbirth, skin diseases, clothing, bodily fluids, rules for priests, and so on. 27 chapters in all. And then on to the next book, Numbers, which seems to be a rehash of Exodus with an additional story about a donkey, 36 chapters in all. And then we move to Deuteronomy, which begins with these words. "These are the words of Moses spoken to all the Israelites." Yes, you're reading the story of Moses for the 3rd time. Even the 10 Commandments are repeated. And you begin to realise that Deuteronomy is the repeat of Exodus with all the interesting bits removed. Which brings me to 2 important questions. Question 1. Which planet is closest to planet Earth? Is it A, Mercury, B, Venus, or C, something else? And the second question is this. What Old Testament laws still apply today? Is it A, all of them, B, none of them, or C, some of them? Both these questions should be easy to answer, but they are a bit more complex than you might think. According to scientists, Mercury is the planet closest to Earth, as it is closer to Earth more often than Venus, which doesn't quite make sense to me, because it's a bit like saying, which is my closest next door neighbour? I would think it's the person that lives next door to me, but if you take scientists' view, it's not them, because they've got children and their children go out to school during the day and the parents go out to work. So they're out quite a lot of the time, as indeed are most of my neighbours. However, There is a couple half a mile down the road, and they don't go out much, and therefore they are closest to me more often than my other neighbours, so they are my closest neighbour. Anyway, let's not dwell on that. Let's move on to the next question, which is, what Old Testament laws still apply today? And there's a good argument for saying any of those answers. Firstly, they all apply. They are in the Bible. We follow the Bible. Therefore, they must all apply. And didn't Jesus say that too? Others would argue it can't be all of them, because some are about the temple, which we don't have. Others about Aaron, who died thousands of years ago. Others are about instant justice, before we had a prison system as a form of punishment. So perhaps it's none of them apply. The law is in the Old Testament, which is the Old Covenant, and Jesus is in the New Testament, which is the New Covenant, which is the law of love. But others would argue that it can't be none of them, because some really do apply now. For example, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Love your neighbour as yourself. Do not kill. It can't be none of them, because some of them really do still apply. So the logical answer is that it must be some of them. But then people would say, well, you're just pick and choosing which laws to apply. 10 commandments? Not for me. I only want to obey 8. These two questions, one about the planet closest to planet Earth and one about Old Testament law, need a bit more explanation than you might first think. So what does Jesus say about Old Testament law? Which ones apply today? You could argue that he says it's some of them, it's none of them, and it's all of them. Fortunately, he goes into a bit more detail. Jesus says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." We often think of Jesus fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament. Matthew reminds us of that again and again. But how does Jesus fulfill the law? Well, it all depends on what you mean by law and how many there are. If you Google how many laws are there in the Old Testament, you're likely to come up with the answer 613. I'm not sure if that's really true. It all depends how you slice and dice it. Not only that, but there are different types of law. They are commonly divided into moral, ceremonial, and judicial. The ceremonial law specifically related to Israel's worship. Its primary purpose was to point forward to Jesus. Let's look at one. Aaron shall take from the congregation of the children of Israel 2 male goats as a sin offering. He shall take the 2 goats and present them before the Lord. Aaron shall cast lots for the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord, and the other lot for the scapegoat. He shall bring the goat on which the lot of the Lord falls and offer him as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot falls is to be the scapegoat. The goat to be sacrificed is a sin offering, while the scapegoat is to be released into the wilderness. The sin offering provides forgiveness, while the other goat provides the removal of sin. So that's where we get the term scapegoat from. Here's another one from Leviticus chapter 4. If any ordinary person sins and doesn't realise it, they are guilty. But as soon as they do realise it, they are to bring a sacrifice of a goat without defect to atone for their sin. However, if they choose to bring a lamb as their sin offering, it must be a female without physical defect, and this will be the sacrifice. The priest shall make atonement for the person, and their sins shall be forgiven. God required animal sacrifices to provide a temporary covering of sins and to foreshadow the perfect and complete sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Animal sacrifice is an important theme that's found throughout the Old Testament because, as the writer to the Hebrews points out, without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. God commanded the nation of Israel to perform numerous sacrifices according to certain procedures prescribed by God. First, the animal had to be spotless. Second, the person offering the sacrifice had to identify with the animal. Third, the person offering the animal had to sacrifice it, and this sacrifice provided a temporary covering of sins. Another sacrifice, called for on the Day of Atonement, that's the one I've just described, demonstrates forgiveness and the removal of sin. Animal sacrifices have ended because Jesus Christ was the ultimate and perfect sacrifice. John the Baptist summed it up when he said, "Look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." You may be asking yourself, why animals? What did they do wrong? But that's the point. Since the animals did no wrong, they died in the place of the one performing the sacrifice. Jesus Christ also did no wrong, but willingly gave himself to die for the sins of mankind. Jesus took our sin upon himself and died in our place. So animal sacrifices were commanded by God so that the individual could experience the forgiveness of sin. The animal served as a substitute, that is, the animal died in the place of the sinner, but only temporarily, which is why the sacrifices needed to be offered over and over again. The laws concerning these animal sacrifices have stopped with Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was the ultimate sacrificial substitute once for all time. Animal sacrifices foreshadowed Christ's sacrifice on our behalf. So Jesus is the fulfillment of the ceremonial law. In the wider context, it can be argued that Jesus is also the fulfillment of the whole Old Testament, which points to the coming of Jesus. Certainly other writers in the New Testament say that. Paul, who was a later follower of Jesus, said that the Old Testament law can be summed up in one sentence: love your neighbour as you love yourself. And as Jesus obeyed the law completely, here's the fulfillment of the law. Anyway, Jesus continues, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven." What law is Jesus talking about here? As I said, the laws are commonly divided into moral, ceremonial, and judicial. I've explained that the ceremonial law no longer applies when Jesus fulfilled it. The judicial law of the Hebrews was adapted to their own civil society. When that changed, the law changed, so that can no longer apply today. Here, Jesus is talking about the moral law, which cannot be changed, such as loving God, loving our neighbour, and so on. These cannot be abolished, as it can never be right to hate God or hate others. The most famous of these moral laws are the 10 Commandments, and Jesus made it perfectly clear they are not going to be abolished or superseded. Jesus concludes this section, "For I tell you, that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, how on earth could we do that? The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were experts. They didn't just obey it and get others to obey it, they could recite it off by heart. How can we do better than that? Well, God's laws were given to help people love God with all their hearts and minds. But throughout Israel's history, the laws had often been misquoted and misapplied. And by Jesus' time, religious leaders had turned the laws into a mess of rules. When Jesus talked about a new way to understand God's law, he was actually trying to bring people back to its original purpose. Jesus did not speak against the law itself, but against the abuses and excesses to which it had been subjected. Or, as John put it, the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, some of those in the crowd were experts at telling others what to do, but they themselves missed the central point of God's laws. Jesus made it clear that obeying God's laws is more important than explaining them. It's much easier to study God's laws and tell others to obey them than to put it into practice yourself. And the Pharisees were exacting and scrupulous in their attempts to follow the law. So how could Jesus reasonably call us to a greater righteousness than theirs? Well, the Pharisees' weakness was that they were content to obey the laws outwardly without allowing God to change their hearts or attitudes. They looked pious, but they were more often than not trying to get other people's approval so they could gloat on their own righteousness rather than God's righteousness. But before we admonish the Pharisees, let's have a look at what they did and ensure we don't do the same. Let's take an example. When Pharisees gave money to the poor, perhaps a beggar on the street, they would drop the coins from such a height that it would make a loud noise. Everyone would turn around and see what they were doing. Do we do that? When we put money in a tip jar in the cafe, do we make sure it makes enough noise so that everyone can turn around and see our good deeds? It's something that I do, I'm afraid. If people don't turn around, I'm tempted to take my tip money out and drop it in again so that people can view what I've done. What about if we give money to a worthy cause? Do we announce it on social media or do we give anonymously? And here's another example. Because the moral laws were written many years ago and have stood the test of time, they are very simple, straightforward, but lacking in detail. And that was no good to the Pharisees. They introduced a whole load of new laws to explain, for example, what work could and couldn't be done on the Sabbath. And they elevated these additional laws to the same as biblical laws. They clash with Jesus when he heals someone on the Sabbath, which according to the Pharisees is prohibited because they classed it as work. Do we do that? Do we elevate things that we believe in to the same status as biblical law? The way the church is structured, the Bible version we preferred, the job we do, the clothes we wear, the accent we have, the politician we vote for. I heard someone a few weeks ago was absolutely shocked that a Christian should vote for a particular party. It was the Liberal Democrats, in fact. I know others who say that the King James Bible is the only Bible you can have. The 1662 liturgy is the only acceptable form of church, and so on. Now, there are many things that we may prefer, but let's not elevate our personal preferences into biblical law. Otherwise, we're no better than the Pharisees. I used to work in an organisation that had a guy that always followed the company rules. Let's call him Liam. Liam used to arrive at work just as the second hand was reaching 9 a.m. He always used to take an hour for lunch, and he was always standing by the exit door with his little briefcase at 5:29, so he could be out of the office at exactly 5:30. He was absolutely a stickler for the company rules. One day he volunteered to get the post that had been put in the company letterbox at the end of the driveway. So he drove his car out of the car park to the driveway to the company gates, which held a small box that contained some letters. He emptied the letterbox and drove back to the office. He actually put in an expense claim for that journey. He even had a VAT petrol seat attached to his expense claim form. However, his boss wouldn't authorise it. His boss said that it would cost in more administration to process the claim than to pay it. He said, just wait until your expenses go over £1 and then claim it then. Well, Liam wasn't very happy and said he was out of pocket by 45p and the company was withholding the money. An argument ensued, and in the end the boss got so angry that he just took a 50p out of his pocket, gave it to Liam and told him to go away. So Liam kept the letter of the law. But was he the best employee that almost said the company name. Was Liam the best employee that the company ever had? No. In fact, he was one of the worst, even though he kept all the rules. In one sense, he was a modern-day Pharisee. You see, the thing is, keeping the rules is not the thing. Not only that, but keeping all the rules is difficult, if not impossible. And if you can, it just makes you self-righteous, or, in the case of Liam, a pain to work with. So let me return to the beginning with these questions. Which planet is closest to Earth, and what Old Testament laws still apply today? The problem is, we're asking the wrong questions. Which planet is closest to Earth is the wrong question. It should be, which planet has an orbit that is closest to Earth? If we just know that Mercury is closest to Earth, it doesn't help us, because it turns out that Mercury is actually closest not only to Earth, but to every other planet. It doesn't help us to understand the order of planets from the Sun. It doesn't stop us asking the question and having a discussion, but it's not that helpful. In the same way, what Old Testament laws apply today is an interesting question, and people have debated it for 2,000 years, and we've discussed some of the answers in the video, but it doesn't answer the questions we should be asking. It doesn't stop the discussion, and indeed, in the First Century Council of Jerusalem, they debated just this point. Jews that had become Christians still followed many of the Jewish laws on circumcision and other ceremonies. But what about non-Jews, or Gentiles as they are called? Should they follow the Jewish law? And if so, what parts should they follow? At the council, they came up with 3 things, and you can read all about it in Acts chapter 15. Interesting though that is, it doesn't answer the question I want answering. I want to know, am I still right with God? I'm a Christian, but I'm not going to church, and even when church reopens, it won't be the same. I'm not meeting with others for obvious reasons. I'm not really helping others. I'm feeling a bit disconnected. I'm likely to be working from home, which means I'll be back on Zoom again. Oh, what joy that will be. So, am I still right with God? What things do I need to do to get me back on track? What laws or rules should I obey during lockdown to make me righteous? Not self-righteous, but righteous before God. I've discovered that's completely the wrong way round. We don't follow God's laws to become righteous. We are made righteous by what Jesus has done for us. So we want to follow God's laws. It's a bit like wanting a car. So you sit at home on the sofa watching TV with a seatbelt on, because that's the law. And as a result, you obtain a car. No, it doesn't work like that. You don't follow the law to get a car. It's when you're in a car, you obey the seatbelt law. Just because you follow the rules doesn't make you righteous any more than saying because the dictionary has all the words in the English language, it's a great piece of literature. Or let's go back to ceremonies. In order to be 21 again, I could have a party and a birthday cake with 21 candles on it. As a result of that ceremony, I become 21. I mean, it's nonsense. I don't become 21 years old by having a ceremony of a birthday party with 21 candles on it. It's because you are 21 that you have a birthday party. It's that way round. I'm made righteous by what God has done through Jesus, and it's nothing I can do. Jesus has done it for me. Through his death and resurrection, my sins are forgiven, and I have been made right with God. This is what it says in another part of the Bible. God made Jesus, who had no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. And somewhere else it says, if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. It's as a result of that I want to follow Jesus and be his disciple. It's that way round. I don't attempt to obey all God's teaching to become acceptable to God. It's because God has made me acceptable that I want to follow his teaching. So, what is the teaching of Jesus that I should follow? Well, during a pandemic, these are the subjects I'd like Jesus to talk about. anger, trust, revenge, lust, love, giving, prayer, worry, and judging others. And guess what? Those are exactly the subjects that Jesus talks about in the next verses in Matthew's Gospel. Now, I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but you could title the next section, How to Remain a Disciple of Jesus During a Pandemic. But that's all coming up in future weeks. All it remains for me to do is to say thank you for watching to the end of this video, if indeed you are still watching, especially during some of the difficult bits. Some of the subject matter was a bit tricky, I have to admit. Let me end by summarising the whole thing with a story. There was a husband and wife who didn't have a happy marriage. That's because the husband gave the wife a rule book that she was to follow, and she was duty-bound to follow all the rules in the rule book. However, every day she failed one of the rules, much to the disgust of her husband. And try as she might to follow the rules, she just couldn't do it. And as a result, she failed to meet up to his standards. Not surprising, the marriage broke down, the husband left, and eventually they got divorced. The good news was she was allowed to keep the house. Many years later, she remarried. Fortunately, this was a much happier marriage. No rule book. She loved her husband, and the husband loved his new wife. It was a very happy marriage. After many years, she was doing a bit of tidying up, and she came across in a cupboard the old rule book from her first husband. So she started to flick through the pages and remembered what it was like. She suddenly became very emotional and started to cry. But it was for a very special reason. She was crying not because she was upset, because as she read each rule, she realised that she was now obeying every single one without even realising it.